Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Joe, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. It's the other half of the Lone Gunman Podcast. Joe, welcome, and please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Robbie. And my name is Joe Borelli. I am a JFK researcher, although I prefer student of the assassination and history in general. I am a co-host of the Lone Gunman Podcast with my partner, Rob Clark, who I know you've had on here before. And I actually have a background in finance. I was in wealth management as a financial advisor for a big financial firm for over 5 years, and most recently in working for a fintech firm doing some consulting on data and pattern analysis. And you might think, how does that jive with the JFK thing? Well, when I was in wealth management, I would, of course, go through all financial documents, quarterly reports, and look for little tidbits, almost like you look for in documents, right? Did they have a one-off sale that maybe boosted their earnings that might skew some of the actual financials? Did they do something in depreciation or accounting? And then in fintech, I analyze vast data sets and look for patterns that from customer behavior that the algorithm can then enhance to better assess the customer they are analyzing. And I think that is going through a ton of numbers, documents, or financial documents. And I didn't know how it would correlate to the JFK assassination, but I a few years ago started doing my own document research, and I found out I was pretty good at it, or decent at it. Let's put it that way.
Working with the RIF numbers or working with specific information in the documents?
RIF numbers, usually targeted specific keyword searching, either through PDF books or Mary Farrell, of course, other like the Harold Weisberg archives, the Malcolm Blunt archives, and also Ancestry.com. That is an underutilized resource, in my opinion, to kind of get other context that might not be available on some of the document sites. But it correlated a lot, and much like what I do for fintech and looking for patterns, I do with documents. And in the past year, it resulted in a couple cool finds that we'll get into soon.
Now, with your JFK research, can you take me through when it started? At least when, besides like how you actually got interested. Did you always have an interest in the JFK assassination, or was this just something that sparked up 6 years ago when you saw something or heard a video?
Yeah, it pretty much. So I've always been a student of history. Pretty much, I've been a World War II. I've had a lot of interest in World War II. My grandfather was Normandy plus 10 bout. And the reason he was plus 10, he was actually going to be in the first day or two, was because his mother died, my great-grandmother, and he was allowed to go back to the States to go to her funeral, and therefore was moved back. And that's probably why I'm here talking to you today. So it's always fascinated me. And I kind of worked my way up through history a little bit. And yeah, I joke, I got my initial associates from YouTube University, right? So I watched a lot of JFK documentaries, and I think it was The Men Who Killed Kennedy, when I was like, wow, what is going on here? And that was about, 2018. And I've been hooked ever since. So after consuming pretty much every YouTube and a YouTube video and documentary, I then moved to podcasts, and I was very lucky to find good podcasts, because as you know, if you find the wrong one, you can get led down a lot of rabbit holes. And I credit me finding the right ones for probably saving me about a decade of nonsense. And I was looking at a few. I searched actually Lee Harvey Oswald, and Rob's The Lone Gunman came up, and it was a image of Lee Harvey Oswald with a kind of podcast headset on, and started listening to Rob. Like, loved his style, loved his attention to the documents, and then through him got introduced to other researchers Larry Hancock, Bill Simpich, Carmine Savastano, document researchers, and many others. That's just a few. So about 2022, I started emailing Quick Hits, which is a podcast that Rob does with Doug Campbell, who was another JFK researcher and good friend of mine, and started going back and forth on some things I found interesting, and then started doing my own document research. And I started messaging with Rob on the side. I had a little theory about, or a question really. It's like, what's up with all these Martins coming up in the assassination story? He started messaging back about it. We then started doing our own research. We had no idea. It was kind of like a fun, kind of lighthearted project. We had no idea where it was going to lead us. And I think the best type of research journeys start that way. And we ended up discovering some really cool things. And now I am the co-host of the Lone Gunman podcast. We presented at Lancer last year, 2023, for the 60th anniversary on our Martin alias theory. And little did I know the things that I wasn't even paying attention to would become the most significant. So,
yeah, before we get into Martin, I just wanted to discuss a few things, obviously, to clear up some just where you stand on the JFK assassination. Now, as a student of history and a fan of history, did you buy the official narrative when you initially heard it?
I don't think so. I can't remember when I can't remember like back in high school reading this about in the history books, like Lee Harvey Oswald did it and had any. I don't really have any memories of that, but definitely when I started paying attention, I realized the official narrative definitely didn't add up. And I think that's the case with a lot of commissions, right? When you have the government kind of investigating itself, you're not going to get all the truth. And so, yeah, I had my major doubts, obviously, about the Warren Commission, and I keep adjusting my working theory. That's what I call it, because it's there's so much, as you know, Robbie, to this case, so many different aspects, the Tippit situation, the medical evidence, the New Orleans, the period of Oswald and the Marines. I mean, there's so many different places you could focus on that it really took me years and years to really build a working theory. And I don't claim to even have it close to figure it out. I think I have a good idea, but I think one of the things I'm very objective. Like, I don't have a certain cause I subscribe to. I don't say this person did it, CIA did it, LBJ did it. I'm very open, and I'm open to everything. I mean, if irrefutable evidence came out that Malcolm Wallace was on the 6th floor, I'd be like, oh, damn me, I'd accept it. But I try to view this from a very objective, almost intentions analysis type of way, and like, what is the intention here, and in all different aspects of the assassination.
Do you stand on or Oswald didn't fire any shots, either at JFK or Tippit? And then where did you first start diving into the JFK case? Obviously, everyone picks a certain aspect of it. I mean, you could try and cover the globe, summarize it when it comes to the medical evidence and all this. But there's one thing that attracts each researcher. Some people focus on Tippit. I initially did in the beginning because I just thought it was weird. There's a cop that gets killed that really never gets talked about, especially in the assassination, unless you're actually learning about it. But basic history, Oswald was the accused assassin of JFK. And that word accused just recently, in like the past year, maybe year and a half, start seeing that more in media articles using the word accused or alleged assassin. But it was always one lone assassin killed JFK. That's it. Nobody ever heard about the cop that was also killed on that day. So I'm curious if you think Oswald fired a shot from the 6th floor or either killed Kennedy or killed Tippit. And then where did you start to dive into in the beginning compared to obviously where you're at now, or looking at documentation and dealing with more of the, not anomalies, they're important stuff, but they're things that go a little bit deeper than what most people will probably go for?
Sure. So I do think a shot was fired from the sixth floor. I think there's a lot of evidence to support that from eyewitnesses and as well as people on the sixth floor, and in some cases, two people on the sixth floor. Um, I do not think Oswald fired a shot at the TSBD. I'm not sure where he was. I think, when you analyze the girls on the stairs and how it, and especially some of the African American employees on the sixth floor that were part of the floor crew that were up there, 15 minutes, and that's ballpark before, and then kind of went down. There's no evidence to support that he was up there waiting for his chance. Oswald is a very nonconformist type of person. So to me, and I'm not saying he was prayer man, but it would be very consistent with Oswald's character to not get involved in, oh, the president's coming, let me go outside and get a good spot. It's very Oswald to kind of walk out towards the end and kind of look and walk back in. I do think he knew very shortly after the shots were fired, oh crap type of thing. And in terms of Tippit, I don't think he shot Tippit either. I think he was going to the Texas Theater, of course, probably to meet a contact. But I think there's a lot of evidence and witness testimony that there was more than one shooter at the Tippit scene. You have two different shells, so I don't think he fired a shot that day. Is my personal opinion, but I reserve the right to be corrected on further evidence coming out, for sure.
Well, you're entitled to your opinion as well, too. I probably would agree with you. Like I said, I try and stay away from, I'm not going to ask you who do you think did it. Obviously, it's a dumb question. I learned that after a year of asking people that. I was like, yeah, let's just stick to something that's the base facts of things and what people can verifiably say this is in my mind. But with Oswald, what makes you think about his character? Obviously, we've both spoken to Larry Hancock, and we know he's got a new book coming out about Oswald, but the Warren Commission version doesn't match a lot of either the actions or a lot of what the witnesses stated about Oswald. I always found it very suspicious that apparently he went up to the guys on the fifth floor and asked what everybody was looking out the window for. They said, well, the president's coming to town. It's like, well, everyone knows there's not like a whole lot of news going on in Dallas. There's no cell phones. Come on now. So I'm just trying to think, why would an assassin do that and lure himself? And also, it's really weird to take a shot from your work. That's like kind of crapping where you eat. So obviously my opinion on that. Yeah.
And to bring the gun in that same morning, right? That's kind of silly.
Do it the day before. I mean, apparently there's rifles going all in and out of the TSBD. Roy Truly said there was a guy that brought in two of them. He's going to hide them in his office. And he's like, oh, just it's common against gun enthusiasts. They like to share their guns. I'm like, you do it at your work? That's crazy. That would not happen today.
Yeah, for sure. It would be extremely low level planning to do so. And I feel like people can use different parts of Oswald to make him this great spy or use him to be this dumb patsy. It's like whatever your belief is, you could nitpick certain pieces of this story and make it fit your narrative. The whole premise that Oswald, as a Marxist, and I do believe that he had genuine left-leaning beliefs. I really do that, and I've looked into it recently. Re-looked into some of the Marine buddies of his statements, and there's a guy, Nelson Delgado, who served with Lee before he went to Japan, actually, who not only said he was a terrible shot, but said he was Hispanic, and Lee would try to speak Spanish to him, and he said he had interest in Cuba and Castro back, I believe he was 59, might have been 58, and was keeping up with his kind of fight in the mountains there. So he was interested in Cuba before he even went and defected to Russia, before he did his stint in the Pacific, in the far Pacific there. So I really do believe he had genuine left leanings. So if that's the case, why would you shoot probably one of the most liberal presidents up to that point? Right? That whole premise makes no sense
It
to
would
me.
make more sense to align with the Walker shooting. But the only issue for me with the Walker shooting is that there was a little boy that was apparently watched two people leave the scene. Which when I asked that about Posner, when I really didn't know the name of the child or anything, he was like, "There's no little boy that saw it happen." And I was like, "I'm pretty sure I've read the document, but much like with all the documentation out there, if you don't screenshot or like save a link to anything, try finding it again is like almost damn near impossible. It's like it disappears."
Oh yeah, I have folders upon folders. How did this get in that folder? It's but I agree with you. I think proverbial gun to my head. Did Oswald take a shot at Kennedy or Walker? And I can't say none of the above. I would say Walker, just based on what we know about him. But I agree with you. Every part of this case is such a rabbit hole and a mystery. But I don't think he took a shot at Walker either, although I think it's more probable than Kennedy. And, you have the whole George de Mohrenschildt testimony of, oh, you took a pot shot at Walker, huh? And Lee smiled and didn't say anything. It's all very bizarre. And of course, George de Mohrenschildt and Lee left for New Orleans. George de Mohrenschildt to Port-au-Prince, Haiti, left very shortly after the Walker incident, which is interesting as well.
When we talk about the lone assassin narrative, have you ever had something where a case lasts 60 years? Or can you ever think of anything where a case would last 60 years and government investigations that have all gone through it and there's still not a definitive conclusion? People can say there is, but there really isn't. I mean, there's a lot of up in the air stuff that goes on in this whole JFK matter. It's probably like the best fairy tale out there. It's got mob figures, CIA figures, everything you could possibly think of all wrapped into one. But it's not that people can't get over the death of a president that could be murdered by a lone assassin or some nobody. It's just that the nobody factor doesn't make sense. And through all the depictions of Oswald, I don't know if he was a silent type. That's what I think. But also you hear him shooting at other people's targets at a range, doing things that just don't seem to align anything with the Oswald that we would think would be the silent type that doesn't really talk to him. Anyway, look at the number of people at the TSBD that talked about never engaging with Oswald, not even seeing him in the building the day of the assassination. So to me, he just seemed like a guy that flew under the radar. But then you have accounts and video of him going on air and talking about Cuba or communist views and all this Marxism stuff. So you get this kind of weird depiction where it's like, who is he? Did he go to Mexico City or not? I have no clue.
That is one of the most mysterious aspects of this case, for sure. I think that Oswald was a loner, or he kept to himself, right? If you were friendly with him, he would be friendly with you, as and if you look at a lot of the Marine buddy statements, they're all very consistent. He kept to himself. Most of the people that were interviewed were like, yeah, I kind of remember him, not really, can't really remember anything specific. He was very kind of nondescript, kept to himself. Of course, he did get court-martialed twice in the Marines. One for having an unauthorized gun and shooting himself or grazing himself in the elbow in the Pacific. I believe it was Indonesia. I could be wrong. And the other one was him pouring a beer on a sergeant's head at a bar. And those are in the documents for the assassination, way before. So there's no way that type of information is like staged to set up this later on. I think he didn't like to take orders from anyone, which is why I push back now, and I wouldn't have a couple years ago, that he was really under the control of certain either intelligence agencies or people. I mean, he was maneuvered from place to place in certain ways for sure, but he wasn't he wasn't one to take orders from anyone, and he was very anti-authority. Is from what I've read, and it's very consistent.
Do you believe that's because he had a rebellious youth, or do you believe that was because he had some type of clearance when it came to being involved in either the U2 program or something that had more of a deeper level of military intelligence compared to maybe the average person? I mean, that can give you a sense of entitlement to you.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It had something to do with his youth and moving around a ton. I think I heard 20 times. I'm not an expert at his early movements, but he moved around a lot, went from school to school, right? Probably got bullied in a sense and a little bit. Of course, we know about his truancy in New York City, right? When he would go to the Bronx Zoo. By the way, I grew up near the Bronx Zoo, so I can respect that. A great place to go, especially as a truant. But and personally, me myself, I was like that as a kid, and I was sent to military academy for 4 years, and it's I could understand that anti-authority. I'm not going to kind of adhere to the system type of thing, and I think he kind of kept that mindset for his most of his life.
Do you think that's what attracted him to the whole communist and type of ideas or ideologies that were out there? I'm not going to use the word communist. I'm going to say Marxist.
Yeah, I think so. I think he was probably in some ways disillusioned with capitalism. And, you have to think kids in those days, they're not on TikTok looking at dance videos. And they're talking, and a lot of his Marine friends say this too, they're debating political ideologies. If you talk about someone like Kerry Thornley, who came up with his own Discordianism religion, we did a couple shows on that, and they're all kind of going back and forth in their own views. This system works, this system doesn't, and yeah, I really think that he was just a young kid trying to figure out what his beliefs were at that point.
When do you think he was contacted by either the FBI or the CIA, or became some type of deeper figure than just someone that was being maneuvered all around? Do you think it was early up in his career, or do you think it was at certain moments in Russia? Like, I believe the John Fain interview, which I would call being a low-level FBI informant, mostly on information to his wife. Doing a patriotic duty would be a better example. But he was interviewed in his car by John Fain for 2 hours. And John Fain stated that that's when he dropped the case on Oswald or closed it because he didn't seem like a threat. He seemed like he was just generally defensive over his family. Didn't want questions or his family being bothered with anything, but he just was curious about Marina, if she was ever going to be contacted by KGB people. Would he let John Fain know, or the FBI know? And he said he would. So I was like, I think that's when he was contacted as like a low level, like, hey, which would explain kind of the payments back to the State Department for them paying for his travel back. Because I believe him tearing up his U.S. citizenship or whatever that is, that's a national incident. The State Department's going to be like, we need to get him back over here. I don't think it was a whole maneuver thing. People can get more conspiratorial if they want, but I think it's probably basic on that front. But I'm wondering if you think he was CIA, FBI, and when do you think he was contacted?
So, and that's the thing about being on this crazy JFK journey, because I've kind of like changed my tune to it semi recently. I think when he was in Japan and he was, going to the Queen Bee and having certain Marxist and left leaning sympathies, definitely for the time, I think that some intelligence agency, probably the CIA at Sugi, realized, because in terms of the false defector program, a lot of those false defectors were killed or never came back. You have like Robert Webster and a couple of things, but if you have someone who is genuinely has these type of like curiosity about the Russian or Marxist communist system and wants to go, and they could kind of dangle him in a sense to see how the Russians react to his defection, you could make an argument that, of course, he had help getting there. When you think about the Helsinki, how he got into Russia through the Helsinki instant visa route, and Bill Simpich wrote a lot on this. It was a route that was opened like a few days before by the CIA chief in Finland. I believe his name was William Castile, who was procuring women and talking with his KGB counterpart, Gregory Golub. And Golub said, if you have someone, they want to go to Russia, make sure they book it through a local travel agency and they'll go right over. And coincidentally, Lee Harvey Oswald uses that exact tactic. It goes over a few days later, right? So at first I'm like, okay, CIA for sure. Like, how could you even argue that? But what if he was just kind of being maneuvered to, right, for the dangle to see how Russians react? All right, this guy wants to go over there anyway. One less Marine or someone in the military we have to convince the false defect. And you also have an aspect of plausible deniability there too, if you're the CIA. So I've been leaning and like kind of thinking that might be more of a possibility recently. So my guess would be in Japan, he was started to get approached based on either his beliefs and or his desire to go there, and they just used him to do that for their own purposes, right? And then you have, of course, Hoover and talking about sending that memo that his birth certificate is being used. So I think his name was used, and I think he was very aware of the help he got in defecting, right? But I'm not sure if he was like a full-on agent. I think he had to make certain, okay, I'll tell you about this. I'll tell you about this, right? Like certain things he had to agree to. And that's just a recent kind of thought I've had that I've been leading to. And, you go back and forth on this crazy journey, right?
You mentioned recent, but in the beginning when you first started researching this, did you ever think that? I mean, would you ever get to the point of being on the level of like someone mentioned to you Oswald was a CIA agent or FBI agent? My initial reaction would have been like, that's the super conspiracy people, the flat earthers that you want to stay away from. Because there was nothing ever being reported about it, but it's within the last year, maybe 2 years, we're seeing classified documents that Oswald was monitored by the agencies. There was the 201 file that apparently didn't exist, and then later came out that it did exist, but all the agencies pulled their files on Oswald. So obviously he's being monitored. There's each investigative, I wouldn't say intelligence agency, CIA and FBI had files on him, but that's not information that was well publicly known until maybe a year and a half ago. I think ever since Tucker Carlson went on air and said all that stuff about the government killing JFK, or there's evidence, Jack Ruby stuff that I was really interested in.
Oh yeah.
It's when I kind of opened up.
Why didn't they bring him to DC? I think is what he said, right? He went off on that recently. I think it is very possible that he was a paid FBI informant. And, I've also been thinking about this recently. I think there were two ways to kind of manipulate Oswald. And that would have either been with money or ideology. And you could be like, okay, thanks, Captain Obvious Joe. But, obviously his financial situation and his trouble getting a job is significant. Moving around, leaving his family, right, in different cities. Of course, when he gets arrested on the fracas, he requests an FBI agent. Very weird activity. I think it's very possible that he could have been a paid FBI informant. In terms of, I think he could have been involved with the CIA as much as like double defectors, right? You don't get them very often. And when you have someone that comes back from Russia, it's a very unique situation. So I think the CIA could have had their own interest in him too. And I think he would have been opportunistic with any way he could have made money. When he got back, I'm talking. So I think both are possibilities.
I respect that you're trying to stay middle ground on a lot of this stuff because obviously there's so much you can get your mind changed the next day on some things. But when you mentioned the family aspect through the work of Larry Hancock, you get a different depiction of Oswald. Mostly a guy who obviously cared about his family. The Warren Commission would paint him out to be a wife beater, but obviously that relationship with Marina Oswald was kind of both sides were at fault there. But he obviously cared about his kids. And to mention what Rob Clark said to me, either not his last episode, maybe the episode before that, but you take a shot from a building a month after you just had a baby. Like, as a parent, why would you do that? Like, he doesn't have kids, at least that I know of. But that's just not something that a guy who cares about his family would do. But then you mentioned the money aspect, which I think was for his family. I mean, you got to think he's living in a boarding house, seeing his kids every now and again, or trying to at least. But the woman Marina's living with doesn't want him there, even though she let him spend the night Thursday night, which is, strange. But there's a lot of things where he just wanted his family back together and out of kind of the Ruth Payne situation that I've started to pick up. I don't know if you've noticed that, or if you've kind of seen things where obviously would give more credence to doing something for money, not killing the president, but doing something where it's low-level activities for someone that's offering, here's $400 for this, here's $500 for this. Hey, let me know if the KGB contacts your wife. I'll give you a couple $100. It's important for us to monitor any type of, communist threat.
For sure. And I think when you look at something like his handing out of pro Castro leaflets, right? It could be both. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. He could have had left leanings and then taken money to do that assignment, right? So I mean, that's something I try to reevaluate all the time, and I said this on the podcast recently. I was like, I'm trying to like redefine my biases and like what have I assumed in the past years of studying this that might not be true. And what has that assumption done to all of my other subsequent beliefs? And I think any good objective researcher has to kind of go back and kind of take stock and be like, what did I possibly have wrong? And it's an ongoing process. I don't know if we'll ever be done with it, but I hope new documents come out someday. We haven't had one in a long time, but about a year.
Yeah. What are your biases, and also what have you changed your opinion on or tune on? Obviously, you can get married to certain theories, but how much do you base in speculation? Because you're not going to have a document that says, hey, here's an order to kill JFK based on the CIA or the FBI. It's just not going to happen. That wouldn't be written down. But a lot of stuff, you do have to lend credence to some speculation. But where's that line for you on that speculation? Because some people, like the Clinton Murchison meeting, no, not in my head. I like talking about it. I think it's interesting. But I just think that it checks off too many boxes, and there's only one person that I've been able to find, and maybe another person that I can't find their statement of when it happened. But when it's a
party before the night,
yeah, the alleged meeting that LBJ said, after tonight, those goddamn Kennedys will never bother me again. Dude, it fits great if you're an LBJ guy. Let me tell you, that's everything you could possibly need. You got big oil money in there. But I did dive down to the oilman's power in Dallas, Texas back then. There is a lot of that. As much as you could say that the West Virginia primary was funded by Sam Giancana or whoever, there is a little bit of evidence to support that there was money transaction getting passed and a lot of money was getting funded towards Kennedy's campaign. But that's through every politician's campaign. Richard Nixon, both times. Howard Hughes funded both his campaign runs and also funded Kennedy's. So he added up just in case one of the horses lost, he still had a horse in the race, which is a smart business move.
Yeah, and a lot of people like that will donate to both sides, because whoever wins, you're going to have some, a card to pull in. And in terms of the Murchison party you mentioned, Nixon was allegedly there too. I've read, and of course I haven't done like a ton of research into this, that like Nixon left pretty early or left that day or that night and wasn't really there. And yeah, you're right. It checks all the boxes. That type of comment you would never make to a mistress, right? That's what who we made the comment to. Uh, and in terms of my own biases, I think I'm like one of the ones I mentioned before, because I think everyone can use, there's so much conflicting evidence in this case that you can back up your theory with all these different, with whatever information how you decide to splice it up. So I think one of the ones that I'm trying to deal with is, okay, I need to be consistent. Is Oswald a super double spy, right? And therefore he's doing all these advanced spy things the whole time, or is he just, or is he not? And some of the points I mentioned earlier. And that's a good example of the type of bias I'm trying to like double check. Of course, there's a lot of other examples I can't think of right now, but yeah, I think it's just a healthy exercise in general, right? If you want to be objective about it, not all people want to be objective about it, and that's fine, you know.
So. What about speculation? Giving any credence to certain areas of speculation?
Oh, I mean, I speculate a ton, and almost in every way. I might sometimes take the middle ground on some things, but that's just because I don't know. But I speculate a ton, and we'll get into some of the speculations that I did with our Lancer presentation last year. And I speculate almost every possible option and possibility for sure. So I'm definitely there on the speculation. I just might not talk about every aspect of it.
Before we get into the Martin stuff, I just got a few more for you just to cover the base, kind of obviously assassination research for anybody that's new and is wondering the many aspects of it. But the investigative arm with the Warren Commission and then the investigative compared with the HSCA. Do you think any investigation has done it right, or do you think that they were all kind of set up to fail or have a determined conclusion?
I definitely think the Warren Commission was set up to have that conclusion for sure. I think the HSCA was a lot more open with some of their areas that they went down. I think they were also kind of they kind of subscribed to a certain, in the HSCA's case, they focused a lot on the mafia, right? So they definitely highlighted those aspects, and I think there's context to be gained in both of them, and what was the general political environment at the time. The late 70s was a very different time than 1963, right? You had, and I actually agree with LBJ in a sense, like if you have people coming up and saying it's Cuba or it's Russia, at least what he told, or Warren, that's going to create a public outrage, and that's going to probably result in World War III at the time. So there was I think a genuine like a legitimate concern that's like, we can't really go down this road because who knows where it's going to lead us, type of thing. HSCA obviously was more open, but I don't think any of them really were designed to get to the truth. We had briefly before we had talked about Richard Sprague, who was kind of outed for Blakey, and from what I've heard, Richard Sprague was much more open to seeing where things were going to lead, and obviously he wasn't given that opportunity.
Well, you can't be surprised there was a mob kind of conclusion when it came to conspiracy with the HSCA, because Blakey was all in charge of RICO and everything like that. It's kind of like, you spent your whole life looking into one aspect of things, and someone tells you, hey, I have this. Do you mind researching it? You're only going to look for the cool mob connections and all that type of stuff. That's every rock you're going to overturn. So that just fits why it ended up that way. But how much, when you examine, obviously, the dysfunction of agencies and the dysfunction of just Secret Service, everything when it came to that day in Dallas, Obviously, there's a lot of covering up, and it doesn't necessarily need to be covering up a grand conspiracy, but covering up the fact that a lot of people weren't doing their job effectively. I mean, the Secret Service should not have been out drinking till wee hours of the morning, the day they're supposed to be protecting the president. There's a lot of things that just seemed like the government was not running what everyone thought it was. And to cover their ass, they really kind of either hid documentation, hid evidence, which made the conspiracy and this big kind of thing go over. So now you're finding out secrets that Secret Service destroyed documents 2 weeks after being requested from the ARRB. And it's like, why would they do that? Well, they're covering their own ass because they obviously, had a lot of things that would probably make them look really, really bad.
For sure. And I think that's one of the things that I really learned in the last few years is that the conspiracy and the cover up, in my opinion, are two different things. And because Alan Dulles was on the Warren Commission doesn't mean that he was necessarily covering up for the CIA's complicity in the assassination. It could have been to protect the secrets like the Castro assassination plots and the Mexico City wiretaps and the photo taking operation and many others, right? So I think that's one of the big things that it goes back to my other point. It's like you can make that point. Look, Alan Dulles did that. He suppressed this. So it was the CIA, but not necessarily, right? Everyone was in cover your ass mode. Every agency. We talk about this a lot on the lone gunman, the interagency rivalry. There was a lot of it, right? Especially back then for information, for assets. And at this point, just because, Hosty burned that letter, right? Which Oswald allegedly wrote to him saying, "Stop following me," doesn't necessarily mean that he was an FBI informant, but they were trying to cover their own ass that they had contact with Oswald and they knew about him. And I think that's pretty consistent with all the other agencies, CIA, Secret Service. I think everyone's trying to cover their own ass and get out of this without scarring type of thing.
How much do you lend to eyewitnesses or ear witnesses, obviously in Dealey Plaza when it comes to number of shots, grassy knoll, all this? Because if you are document based, which I do believe you're like Rob, you go kind of what the document says, you can get a lot of information, but there's obviously things that, much like you mentioned with Richard Sprague, when we talked about off air, there are things that you will hear from people or you will get from someone who has no connection to the JFK assassination that might enhance your thoughts, and you lend that. Like, I've interviewed people who are JFK researchers, and they'll say something that they interviewed this person, and this is what they told them. Do they have it on video? Well, some do, but sometimes it's just a conversation they had. It's a great story. Do I use that as evidence, or do I just say that's a cool little tidbit to add in there? And I'll give you an example. I was talking to a guy about, I swear this is 100% true. It's about male mental health, but really it was the whole conversation. He's a researcher in Florida, a university professor who studies testicular cancer. I swear, like my show covers all the whole wide range. And we were talking about it, and he goes, "I got to tell you a story about Arlen Specter." And I go, "What?" He go, "I used to be a waiter at a bar, and he would always come in at this bar and get a martini glass, whatever drink that he ordered, but he would want 3 olives on a toothpick placed perfectly in the center on top. It had to be like that, and he wanted it carried over on a giant tray, just the single drink, and placed directly in front of him, not off to the side, directly in front of him." And he just gave me that as an aside. And I was like, I don't know what that is, but that makes that dude even fucking weirder for me. And I don't trust him. And that's what there's interesting tidbits you hear about that, or you'll hear or see an account from a witness that talked about seeing this or this at a certain instance that happens to do with the assassination. You're like, I don't, you can't really use that as that's kind of hearsay, but you can still keep it in the back of your mind as to give you, like I said, that's the speculation part, but give you motive to kind of draw your own conclusions personally. It doesn't have to be publicly.
I agree. And I love those type of kind of offhand statements from someone that might have known someone involved in the case that we study that isn't a JFK researcher, that had that, say, random experience with Spectre. And I think that gives a lot of insight into character. Of course, it is hearsay. You can't really use it to formulate your theory, but it adds context. And to your question about witness statements, I mean, we've done a lot of this, and analyzing witness statements, especially around the TSPD and Dealey Plaza, is a never-ending kind of circle of contradicting information. Our general rule is, Rob's and I, is kind of like the earliest witness statement, the day of the initial FBI report, is much more significant than the one they give to a documentary in 1980 something. Of course. So, and then we also have to look at what's their motive, right? Have they made money on it? Do they want fame? It's some people and then some people come out decades after with something, and you're like, what do I do with this? Right? It's not an exact science, of course, and I think you just got to do the best in kind of evaluating intentions, and I think, we try to go to the earliest ones and then link that up with some of their how much of their story has changed over time, type of thing. And I think that's one of the few things you could do, right? Because we weren't there. A lot of these people aren't alive anymore. If they are, and sometimes like their kids or their spouses will make statements about them, come up with this, and that's a whole nother can of worms. It's extremely confusing.
Now, you mentioned that when you spoke at Lancer, you talked about the number of Martins in the case. We can start going into some of your work on the Martins. Real quick, was Martin Short one of them? Or is it like, does it have to be a last name?
It doesn't have to be a last name. Martin Short was not one of them.
Damn it. You know who Martin Short is?
You know what? I heard the name, but I don't. I'm going to be honest there.
Steve Martin, one of them. Even better.
Oh, the actor?
Yeah, well, Martin Short was on what is that show, Arrested Development? But he's Jiminy Glick. He wears the fat suit and interviews people, and he's a famous comedian. It's fine.
Or Dean Martin.
There you go. I would believe it, to be honest with you.
Well, yeah. So, and as we segue into the Martins here, at this point in my JFK journey, I'm listening to podcasts. I'm watching everything that comes out in the JFK assassination. And I thought to myself, what's up with like all the Martins coming up? Because I mean, there's a few Smiths in here in the assassination as well, but they're not even close to the amount of Martins. And I'm going to read off this list in a second. And what we did was we didn't just compile Martin names. We have J Martins, as in their first, or in one or two cases, middle name were J. So one of the most popular Martins was, of course, Jack S. Martin, which was the private investigator working under Guy Bannister, who famously got pistol whipped in one of the opening scenes of JFK. And he had 3 different Martin aliases, and his real name was Edward Suggs. He was a pilot in World War II. He was injured. He was in and out of different mental institutions in the 50s. He kind of a grifter, but he finds himself in a very prominent situation when it comes to this case in terms of working under Guy Bannister. And when the FBI talked to him on November 23rd, 1963, he was the one that dropped the dime on David Ferry. So I'm gonna name off a couple Martins here that aren't as popular. You have John C. Martin, who was the head of security at the International Trade Mart in 1963. You have John Martin Jr., who was the postal worker, worked with Harry Holmes, and who filmed at a Dealey Plaza film. Speaking of films, and we'll get into this Martin in a second, John Thomas Martin, who took the famous and mysterious video of Walker's house, being inside Walker's house, and then catching Lee Harvey Oswald's street fracas with the Cuban exiles and Carlos Bernier on the same roll of film. And you have another John Martin. This guy is Johnny Martin. He was involved, and that's a PG-13 word, with Sarita Odio, who is Sylvia Odio's younger sister, and offered her arms for her anti-Castro movement. And of course, their father was in jail in Cuba at the time, and that's where you get that whole.
Wait, he was shacking up and then also selling firearms while he was doing it?
So he shacked up with her and then offered her arms very subtly.
Damn.
Yeah. So this kind of could have been like a first attempt at the Odios, which is very interesting. You have Jean Martin, which was the New Orleans alias of Pierre Lafitte, which was the subject of Coup in Dallas by Hank L. Borelli. No relation there to me. John Martin Thorne, who was Marina's lawyer during the Warren Commission, and he was introduced to Marina by James Herbert Martin, who we were going to get into, and that was Marina's business manager and agent. And she moved into his house with her two kids on November 29th, 1963, about 5 days after Lee was shot in the basement by Jack Ruby. And speaking of Ruby, one of Ruby's lawyers was named James Wilford, Jim Martin. And there was a famous meeting at Ruby's apartment between a bunch of people. George Senator, Jim Martin was there.
Bill Hunter, Jim Cothey.
Yeah. And all of them, except this Jim Martin, did not survive past a couple of years. Jim Martin was the only one.
Yeah, Bill Hunter had a heart attack, and then Jim Cothey was stepping out of his shower and had blunt force trauma, which was considered a karate chop to the throat. I'm talking about Larry after I speak with you. I'm talking to him about that because he interviewed Jim Cothey's wife and stated that, yeah, it was a karate chop. And that's the only clip of mine that got me a flag on YouTube about the JFK stuff because they're like, it's a harmful conspiracy. I was like, I have the autopsy. It says karate chop. Blame it on the doctor. That's his fault for putting that there.
Yeah, that is it's a very interesting how this guy was really, and some of them, I'm not saying all of those deaths were suspicious. Some of them definitely are, which is interesting that this Jim Martin was the survivor of that. You have a Jack W. Martin. I know I'm confusing you guys here. Believe me, Rob and I spent months trying to figure out this. Jack W. Martin was a Secret Service suspect who had an APB put out on him on November 22nd, 1963, even before Lee was arrested. We have that document. All this is backed up by documents on everyone. Billy Joe Martin was a DPD motorcycle cop behind JFK's motorcade. There's a Joseph James Martin, who was CIA from 50 to 58, intel assistant. We thought he was the same as Jack S. Martin from New Orleans. He's not. We wanted to make that connection, but we couldn't. Well, you have a Jolly Joe Martin, who was a radio DJ in Omaha. He actually sung in the Republican National Committee. Can't remember which year. I think it was 1968. I could be wrong. But he shielded Thomas Edward Beckham from extradition to New Orleans during the Garrison trial and was later kidnapped by the CIA himself. And there was a lot of MK-Ultra type of things that were going on there. He was found cowering in the corner, kind of not making sense. But next we have a Roland J. Martin. I mean, this doesn't end. He was the owner of Martin's Cafe, appropriately enough, in New Orleans, where Lee Harvey Oswald cashed 9 of his checks from Riley Coffee Company. And you have Lewis J. Martin, an alias of Lewis McWillie, close friend of Ruby, gunrunner, friend of Traficante, mob associate in general. And that is just some of them. I skipped over a few of them in the interest of time, but that was like our initial, and we didn't find a lot of these until later on. But our thing is this an alias? Is this, what's going on here? Eugenio Martinez also had, who of Watergate fame, but was also an active Cuban exile in 1963, had two J. Martin aliases. I believe it was John P. and John W. You had James McCord, also of Watergate fame, who had an Edward J. Martin alias when he was arrested, and during the Watergate hearings told him that E. Howard Hunt distributed this Martin alias to him. So it's fascinating, and that was the kind of premise of our initial research journey. And it's kind of light and fun. Was this an alias? Was it not? But it evolved into something more, and it was kind of ended up being a really detailed study on two Martins specifically. And I'm going to start with John T. Martin, who, as I mentioned earlier, was the student. He was a 17-year-old student at the time who filmed inside General Walker's house and then caught the Lee Harvey Oswald fracas on the same roll of film. I know Gary Schoner has talked about this on your show in the past. I've corresponded with Gary last year. Very nice guy, very helpful to me. And so John, I'll back up a little bit. John Martin gave his video to the FBI in December of 1963. They returned it. He later claimed it was edited. And then when Harold Weisberg and Gary Schoner in 1968 were in Minnesota doing, I think they did like a 10-hour radio show. This guy called up, and this was John T. Martin. And he said, I have a film related to the assassination I think you'd like. So they actually met up with him after the show, and he gave them, Weisberg and Schoner, this film. And they end up contacting someone else, and you're going to laugh at this. His name is Mike Patsy.
Bernie Madoff? Bernie Madoff? Is that what we're doing here?
Patsy, yeah. Yeah, I know, that's funny. And he helped with the technical video aspect of it. And so this video kind of was under the radar for a long time. It kind of came out in the early 2000s to the research community. It actually was submitted to the HSCA as well. And but further inspection reveals that the film is not the original, but a copy of a copy, which may account for the poor quality of the images. Martin says the film, now in the sixth floor museum's collection, is the film returned by the FBI in 1964, but later inspection shows the film's date code shows 1977. So that film was borrowed during the HSCA in the late 70s, and that's the date code on the current Martin film that we had, which makes me think the copy was made at the HSCA, which is the one we're seeing now, which is very interesting. But just to back up from the film, it does start with the student in a plane filming the clouds. It then goes to New Orleans, to General Walker's house. He's filming from inside the house, the bullet hole, and the outside of the house, the mailbox. It then cuts to another image of John Martin in the plane, and then he's in New Orleans, and it goes through a bunch of New Orleans sites, the City Hall, the big horse statue there. I believe it's of Andrew Jackson in Jackson Square, and then captures Lee Harvey Oswald fighting with the Cuban exiles. So how does this kid capture this video in one reel of film, all these occurrences? Is it coincidence, or is there something more? that's what Rob and I try to figure out. And Gary Schoner was a big help with this. And this is the working theory that we have right now. So we figured out, because John Thomas Martin was never identified. No one knew who he was. He was very mysterious. It was actually called the Jack Martin video for a while, which makes it even more confusing. He is nowhere to be found, and of course is giving his film to the Sixth Floor, the HSCA, the Weisberg and Schoner. So why? Our best. Oh, let me back up. So the initial thought was, because John Thomas Martin was a Minutemen, right, which was an extreme right organization that was very, very conservative. And that's why we think he sought out General Walker, right? That makes sense. So no one knew who he was. The initial thought was that he served under Walker in Germany and then served with him when he got back. But we figured out that he did not. He was actually 17 years old in 1963, which would have made him like 14 or 15 when Walker was serving in Germany, which is impossible. And that was the community consensus for a long time, right? This guy was serving under Walker, made this video. But we proved he wasn't, because not only did we find his military school, high school picture. So this is another thing that gets confusing, because in his high school picture, he's pictured in a uniform and it says Sergeant John Martin. So everyone saw that and was like, oh, look, he was in the military. Well, he wasn't. He was actually in military school. And I noticed that because, like I mentioned, I went to military school. And his bio on his senior military school was very conservative Republican, wants to abolish the Supreme Court, which I guess was a far-right stance at the time, chess club, blah, blah, blah. We found, we have this Minuteman card has been available to the community for a while, but we dug deep and we found his University of Minnesota student directory, where we went and found his name, graduating in 1967 with the same address, 1752 Eigelhart, that was on his Minuteman card. So, boom, this is the same guy. And his Minuteman card puts hobbies as chess and other things that correlate to his high school bio. So now we identified the John T. Martin. So the way we saw it, there are three possibilities. It's either a huge coincidence that this guy, who was on a family trip, by the way, in the summer of 1963, he goes to Dallas, he visits his hero's house, which is General Edward Walker, or someone he looked up to. General Walker invited him in. He took the video of the slides of the bullet hole from inside the house, and then goes to New Orleans. But what Rob and I and Mr. Schoner actually agreed with this as the most plausible theory, probably went to New Orleans on General Walker's behest. He might have gone and said, like, how can I help, sir? Right? And he goes, well, might have seen he had a video camera, right? Not super popular for 63, right? Why don't you go to New Orleans and contact someone over there? Now, we speculated, here we go, we're speculating, that person could have been Guy Bannister or someone of this sort. And then Guy Bannister or someone else connected to the right wing told him to go film this event in New Orleans, this fracas, which a lot of people have said was kind of a fake fracas. I'm not sure, but either way, he was sent there and he got it on tape, which is the odds of that happening and visiting Walker's house on the same reel of film a few days before, the odds are astronomical. Or the third, it was spliced in later, right? The film is not, it was screen recorded. I talked about the 1977 day code, not the 63 day code. So there's really only those three things. It's coincidence. It's he went to New Orleans, talked to Walker. Walker told him to go, if you want to help, go to New Orleans, contact this guy. Or it's edited, spliced film. Those are the only three rational possibilities.
Which one are you leaning more towards? I like the
So
second one a lot.
that is my favorite. I think it's just the most likely, right? This kid is a fan of General Walker. He goes to his house, he films Walker's house, and then how can I help, sir? He's in military school. He's going to be a Minuteman shortly after. It's very, very possible that Walker told him to do that. But then that brings up the point: did Walker have pre-JFK assassination knowledge of Oswald? And he later claimed that his connects at the DPD told him that, right, Ruby and Oswald were detained in connection with the Walker shooting at some point.
I don't believe in association between Jack Ruby and Oswald. And honestly, it was getting me upset reading all the Carousel Girls and making video format for them, because all of them were like, there had to be some type of homosexual relationship or something. I'm like, where are you guys getting this? I don't see any other evidence. But then with General Walker, I believe he knew a lot more than obviously people. I believe that he didn't come out about Oswald taking the shot at him until after Oswald shot JFK. I believe he was using that as like an association to be like, hey, if you think Kennedy was great, Oswald tried to shoot me too, so obviously we must be in a line somewhere. But
yeah, it was political. I think it was taking advantage of that situation. It was like, oh well, that was the guy that shot at me. I think that's most likely.
But Walker wrote letters when either to the FBI or to someone when he was incarcerated for something. I guess he was doing some type of tour where he was going, making all these speaking engagements, and he happened to incite a riot or something like that. That happened, and he ended up getting arrested. But the letters state, and it's apparently they're from Walker, but they sound like they're from somebody else, like a fan or a friend. They're like, while he's incarcerated, don't let anybody perform any psychiatric evaluations on him. And then they kind of go into the whole MK Ultra style things in the letter. And I go, is this more well known? Because I'm pretty sure we didn't find out about this until like the Watergate stuff. So he's saying this in like 64 or 63. So it's not making sense to me how he's aware of that information unless he had inside knowledge or it was just something of the times back then. And I've spoken to private historians, not about that focus into JFK stuff, but just focus into the Cold War. That was not well-known knowledge at all about LSD and all that stuff that was being used. That came out way after the fact. So he had inside knowledge from somewhere on certain things. And I don't think he was involved in killing Kennedy. I just think there was a lot of aspects of he probably knew what was going on or had some inside information or knew someone who did maybe perform or manipulate the act, whether if it came to a certain agency or whether it came to a certain individual.
Yeah, I think I'd probably agree with that. General Walker was actually in New Orleans on November 20th, 63, meeting with Judge Leander Perez, which is also a very far right-wing character. And I think it's possible he did know of this Oswald doing these overt communist activity and kind of put it together really quickly, where he was able to come out pretty close after the assassination and say, oh, he tried to shoot at me too. I think that's probably the most likely, yeah.
Because RFK got a hold of that information at some point and then requested the FBI do an investigation into that as well. He wanted to know if the same person that shot his brother happened to take a shot at Oswald or take a shot at Walker, mostly because it didn't make sense to him. I forgot there's a report to that, but I don't remember what the document number to that report is. Like I said, you end up missing things if you don't screenshot it. But Walker was another interesting aspect with the Tippit murder for me in the beginning. It's another one of those things where it's like, damn, this guy's how is he getting away with all this stuff? Then he buries his rifle apparently in a backyard somewhere on the basis of what Marina said, and then you get into that whole mess of her. I mean, do you trust her as a witness at all? I mean, I kind of like to think that she was obviously fearful that she was going to lose her kids or be deported. And I believe that she was kind of strong armed or bullied by some of the presence of the police force and Secret Service. But I don't know. I was like, if you got to just not touch your testimony with a 10-foot pole if you're trying to stay even ground, whether it's lone nut or conspiracy, because Posner used her in the beginning for the Warren Commission. But then when I had him on and I showed him what the HSCA got out of her, that she didn't know the difference between a rifle and a shotgun, he didn't want to agree with it. I was like, well, then you just drop it. You can't use her as a reliable person anymore. She's flipped too many times.
Yeah, it's another one of those crazy enigmas and rabbit holes in this assassination is Marina. And I think one of the things that's so frustrating is she's obviously still alive. She has interacted with a lot of the community decades ago, not recently. And I think one of your recent guests was like, oh, I talked to Marina 3 times in the 90s. And I was just like, oh, I got so jealous because I was like, it's a perfect segue, Rob. Because I would ask her not about her testimony or this or Russia. I'd be like, what's up with James Herbert Martin? And James Herbert Martin, and that's why I said it's a great segue, is the other Martin that we found a ton of new information on. And James Herbert Martin is not like a common name when you think of the assassination. I think a lot of people that are like interested in assassination enthusiasts might not know who he is. So I'll start from the beginning.
He's got 3 first names. That's suspicious as hell.
Yeah, right. I thought that was only resolved for like assassins, right? But James Herbert Martin was Marina's business manager and agent, and pretty much her babysitter. And he worked as a manager at the Six Flags Inn, which was a motel in Dallas. And that's where the Secret Service took the Oswald family, and that is Marina, Marguerite, Robert, Marina's kids, on the night Ruby shot Oswald. That would be November 24th, 1963. So Martin also admitted in his Warren Commission testimony to knowing Jack Ruby because they were both in the club business, which, of course, everyone seemed to know Jack Ruby, so that's not particularly nefarious. But he invited the Oswald family to Thanksgiving dinner in 1963, and this is like, what, a couple days, maybe a day or two after Lee was shot, right? And then offered Marina and her 2 kids to move into their home with his wife, Wanda, and their 3 kids. At the time, it was 14 and 12-year-old boys, 2 boys, and a 6-year-old daughter. So you have James and Wanda Martin. You have their 3 kids inviting Marina to live with them and their 2 kids. And in the Warren Commission testimony, they asked, did you consult your wife before making this, before reaching out and giving this invitation to Marina? And he goes, no. I don't know if that's a 1963 thing. We'll get into Wanda Martin and his wife a little bit. There's a document we found on her in the releases, in the 2023 JFK releases in April, that is going to blow people's minds. But James Herbert Martin was working in the hotel industry. Previously, he was from St. Louis, the Hilton hotel chain. He later became a credit card salesman for the Carte Blanche credit card company, and then kind of disappeared for a couple of years. There's no mention from him from July of 1959 until about mid-1962, which is very interesting. We'll get into that. But Rob and I found a document from the DPD Criminal Intelligence Division. This was a document on December 2nd, 1963. And it's pretty much giving the details of who James and Wanda Martin are, right? This subject was born here, this, that. But the most interesting part of this document is handwritten on the bottom of it. It says straight line installed December 3rd, 63. So that's the day after the document with the number to the White House communication staff. So essentially, James Herbert Martin in his house, the house that Marina was living in, had a direct federal lease line circuit directly to White House communications, written on top of a DPD memo found in the DPD archives on their site. And no one had ever found it. And if they did, they didn't talk about it. Larry Hancock was blown away by this. He actually used to work for a phone company and was like, this is crazy, and gave a ton of context on how that line would have been installed and the circuit breakers and like who it would have gone to. And that was one of the two.
I think I've heard it before. I realized if you might look back on McBride's first episode on my show, I think he mentioned it. It's either that or Gary Schoner is the only two names I could possibly think of that might have mentioned it. I don't think McBride ever published it, though. I know I've heard it before about a line in the house, but I thought it was when the Secret Service were monitoring Marina for like the first couple, it was like week or so after the assassination.
In the Six Flags Motel.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long time. Like I said, if it's McBride's first time, that would have been 3 years ago almost that he would have mentioned that to me. But I think you guys definitely probably expanded more on whatever that is, or initially found it, if I'm mistaken. But you hear these things, and it's so hard because, like, especially with McBride, he'll say a bunch of things, and then you're like, "Shit, what are we on?" And it's like he's talking about George Bush, and you're like, "What the? How the hell did we get here?" But I love that. Like I said, that they got all these knowledge in their head and stuff. You end up missing out on half of this stuff, especially like with Wecht. I spoke to Wecht. I just never published his episode. So it's like they got a lot of good stuff in there, but then you're trying to fucking there's too much sometimes.
There's so much information and a lot, and sometimes good information like this can get lost, but it's significant, and if McBride did talk about it, like kudos to him. It's very interesting because you could take it from the LBJ standpoint as okay, or just the general Secret Service standpoint. Okay, we're tired of guarding Marina and her family. Let's get her somewhere else. Okay, if you're going to move in with this guy, James Herbert Martin, you better pick up the phone if something comes up, type of thing. It's very plausible, right? Doesn't have to be an LBJ ordered thing, although the LBJ people could definitely use that. And Wanda, his wife, is a very, very even more interesting thing. And this is what I'm going to get into next. So his wife, Wanda, a very kind of mysterious figure. No one really talks about her whatsoever. But in April of last year, as I briefly mentioned, there was a document released on NARA. And I have it screenshotted, Robbie, just in case it disappeared. And op file on Mrs. James Herbert Martin. And undated, but there's a cursive letter written that we've done our best to decipher. And a lot of the words are it's hard to read, but it says, not your typical wife, wire intercept. She could have plausible deniability, wire intercept. The case could be made either way. And what we found was James Herbert Martin's wife was under oral contract by none other than the Central Intelligence Agency in 1964. And this was under Operation Die Circuit. And Die is actually a Czechoslovakian prefix that dealt with that part of Europe. Circuit, I think, makes sense with the Federal Lease Line Circuit, which is what it would have been. But the document we have is from the chief of base Berlin, right? Berlin, that's Germany. and the subject is engagement of spouse, blah, 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 or redacted as redacted. So we got this document and we're like, wow. The person who was living in a house with Marina 5 days after the assassination was under oral contract by the CIA. Now, was she CIA before this? Was she CIA? Did the CIA try to take advantage and recruit her after Marina moved in? Possible, since it's an oral contract. It says the effective date of the oral contract extension is June 64 and that shall continue thereafter until termination of tour of duty. So we got a lot of weird.
I got two questions. I got two questions here. One, how active is, do you notice that there's so many CIA like connections with a lot of these people? Like it seems like everybody's cousin or like step brother or somebody is connected to the CIA. And two, how do I get a part of this where I can just be, I'll stop talking shit if they just let me be part of CIA. Like I will, I swear. Just tell me who killed JFK. I'll keep it private. I promise I won't post it on Twitter or anything. I'll post it on Twitter 100%. Just as an aside. But no, that's crazy. I mean, there's a lot of people, have you noticed, that have some type of connection to a CIA or something like that, which made me try and understand the context of like, was the CIA actively recruiting more than they've maybe done it today? Obviously, it's been a good span of time difference. But there's a lot of stuff where I'm reading memos and things of that sort where this person has background connections with this military industrial complex idea or some type of weapons manufacturer, or someone has a connection with an FBI agent or a CIA agent, where I'm like, damn, dude, it's like everywhere you look. And look, with an event like the Kennedy assassination, it's been handpicked by a lot of people with a lot of varying perspectives for 60 years in various aspects. You're going to come across a lot of things that just seem like, is that real? Like just because people are digging so much. But have you ever wondered why there was so many people with CIA contacts or information or something that had some type of connection to an intelligence agency throughout this?
Well, that's very interesting because I think as we evaluate this 60-ish years after, it's very easy to make connections, right? So you could have someone that went to school or was friends with someone who was in an agency later, right? Went to college there, was a roommate. This person was later maybe a lawyer for the Warren Commission. And you can make that connection, right? This person was connected to him because this person was CIA and this person roomed with him. Or, in the case of like Ruth Payne, although that's more of a direct example of her sister and her father working for whatever company front he was working for. It doesn't necessarily prove that they're connected. And we can make that connection. We could make it fit the narrative, our personal narrative if we want to. So I think there's a lot of connections and things like that happen that might not necessarily be as relevant as we want them to believe, as we want to believe. But in the case of James Herbert Martin, his wife being under oral contract with the CIA, that's really a direct connection. And Rob and I have theorized, and I don't want to say argued, but just healthy conversation back and forth. Who was this guy working for? Was he working for the Secret Service? Was he working for the FBI? Was he working for the CIA? Was he just, and Larry Hancock thinks, was he just like a great opportunist, which is possible too. And we don't know. My guess, I'm going to lean. See, this is where it gets difficult. You could be like, was he CIA? What does that mean? Was he an informant? Was he paid at some point? It's almost like we can make as much connections to that as we want, right? And speculate on those type of things. It's extremely hard. I think that's one of the reasons we have such a hard time kind of deciphering this whole mess.
What are you leaning towards?
James Herbert Martin. I think just based on the fact that his wife was involved in some type of wire intercept for the CIA that you would have to think he is somewhat connected with that. I'm not saying he was an agent, but the last thing I'll say on him. So when Oswald came back to Russia, right, and Marina and June, they were on the SS Mazdam. Okay. Rob and I, as we kind of went crazy in our search here, we're going through the Mazdam Manifest.
It's connected to the Titanic. Who would have fucking... No, I'm kidding.
And we found J.H. Martin's name with 4 guests in his party, aka his 3 kids and his wife, on the manifest with Lee Harvey Oswald from, was it France to New York City, I believe it was. And of course, we can't prove that James Herbert Martin was on the Mazdam. It would be it would be speculating a lot to say they were activated in Europe and then brought back with the Oswalds, because that'd be a risk. Because then if you're going to have Marina move in with him later, she might notice him. But of course, Lee was dead at the time. But then again, you have that Die Circuit memo going to Berlin, the chief of base Berlin, which was kind of similar to the Mexico City in Europe, right? Kind of was like the main station. It's fascinating, and I'm kind of staying in the middle here because I don't know. I have my suspicions, but there are a lot of crazy things going on with James Herbert Martin, and the two, like I said, this Martin thing, whether you think it's an alias, if it's not, it's a coincidence. It's kind of irrelevant to this, because James Herbert Martin had a direct line in his house, the White House, and his wife was on an oral contract by the CIA. That alone gives more context to the surveillance that Marina was under directly after. And possibly did the CIA kind of pull rank and get their guy in there? Or there's a ton of possibilities. We're still theorizing. We're still doing more research on the subject, on the number, on the building that the White House, that those communications were going to. And Larry has helped a lot with that as well. So it's interesting, and we're not done researching, but this, like I said, the Silly Martin project turned into finding out some really cool things. On the guy took the mysterious video, John T. Martin, and of course, James Herbert Martin. And those are the real names for both those guys, by the way. So those are not aliases.
How hard was it to deal with aliases when you're trying to find documentation on certain individuals? Obviously, you come across names and you go try and search up those names. They don't pop up. If you're looking at Mary Farrell's site, or if you're using anything when it comes to National Archives, then you find out, like, a really dumb example is Jack Ruby. There's a lot of documentation under Jacob Rubenstein. So you can find a lot of interesting stuff about that. But for me, it was difficult because you come across things like T1 or T2, and then you come across, so maybe, like, who is this special informant, or who is this person? Are you referencing this person, or are you referencing somebody else? And then you end up coming across, like, his name's not Bob Jackson. It's goddamn Woody Harrelson's dad sitting over there. What are you talking? Like, you just come across something that's like, okay, so it's the complete I mean, it's difficult. It makes it difficult as a researcher to try and get documentation, especially if you have to think about it not being released yet, and then someone filing a Freedom of Information Act request and filing under a name where they go, nothing came back. And you're like, well, I know there's a file that exists on this person. Well, we don't have a file. Okay, so you're lying to me. Well, they're not lying to you. It's under a different name.
Yeah. So actually, thank you for that question, because that reminded me. So I'm going to answer your question. I'm just going to back up. When James Herbert Martin, he's very important because he kind of molds. You have to take Marina from a grieving widow, as much as, she may have grieved, and I think she did grieve a certain amount, to testifying in front of the Warren Commission 2 months later and completely throwing him under the bus, right? You have to have someone helping make that transition for her in terms of what she says. And James Herbert Martin, ironically, ends up having an affair with Marina at the Willard Hotel in DC, which is where he was staying with Marina and the lawyer, John Martin Thorne, can't make it up, who ironically had applied to be an FBI agent in 1951 and was recommended unfavorably because he was making movies that weren't above board in those times. And I was going through a bunch of the Willard documents, and it was like DLT1, DLT2, said this, said that. They moved into this room then. And I was looking through all these documents. I was like, who is this informant? And on one of the documents, on like the very bottom, it said DLT1 is the hotel manager at the Willard. So then you kind of have to work back and insert that and go back and reread those. What did DLT1 say? Did that at the Willard Hotel where they were staying? And how does that kind of correlate to, and then use that to fill in other documents where DLT1, I mean, in the Willard, it's kind of specific to that specific informing operation, but you kind of have to work backwards. Is, I guess, my long answer to that. And it is somewhere you could definitely do process of elimination to figure out, okay, if I don't know the name, it's either him or him, because only those people could be in the situation to give that type of information, and then kind of fill in the blanks and see which one makes the most sense, right? So I didn't know that the DLT1 was the Willard hotel manager, which makes sense that you have someone in charge of that hotel that's informing on Marina and James Howard Martin and John Martin Thorne, her lawyer, but also other people that would have stayed there, right?
Well, it's the Hoover strategy. That's how Hoover got into politics in the first place, was he was standing out in front of motels interviewing prostitutes and watching politicians go in there, and he was getting dirt on people.
Yeah, exactly. So, then you can kind of go back and see, in maybe places not relating to JFK, in that hotel, was there informants? And you could maybe make that connection. Well, this was the guy that was informing in this situation, so it's most likely he was informing in that situation. Maybe it was a foreign leader staying at the Willard for whatever Washington, D.C. event, state visit, whatever, right? So that's kind of the way I go about it. I don't know if that makes sense, but you could sometimes fill in different parts of documents by entering the RIF number, and some parts of documents different parts will be redacted. So you can almost like fill in the blank. So this sentence is redacted in this document, but isn't redacted in this document. But it's a big puzzle, really.
Through all the years you've researched, obviously you can sit there and beat the bush on the same story, rehashing the same facts, even though it might be new to a lot of people who just, obviously a large amount of people do not have an interest in caring about the assassination. Surprisingly, that's a wide accepted view amongst a lot of people. But for the people that want to go a little bit further is why I appreciate the Lone Gunman podcast and the work that you and Rob do. Also Quick Hits as well too, Doug's work on a lot of things, because you guys kind of go for people who already know the story or have an idea and a good understanding and want to know specific details. We have a source to go to, or at least something to listen to, that kind of covers the globe on those types of things. But for you, did you get tired of looking at the basic story and the plots and the very simplistic or kind of easy cut cover up or shenanigans that were going on, where you go, I want to go a little bit deeper. I want to get into specific names. I want to hear testimonies. I want to go down and try and find a new avenue, which obviously, like I said, it's been picked for 60 years, but there is still probably a lot of meat left on the bone as it comes to new information that can possibly be coming out, because we still have documents withheld. There's still giant questions where you ask somebody about, where's Kennedy's brain? Well, it's a kind of unsolvable one. I've gotten it down to a point where I'm like, I know Robert Kennedy had something to do with it, because there's a lot of transferring of fucking materials, and I followed that whole process, but Berkeley is the last person I can really kind of get it placed to.
I heard recently that it was because they didn't want them doing a type of toxicology and seeing how much drugs JFK was on. Just something I heard about that. But to your point, and it's funny you bring up the medical evidence, because this case has obviously been researched to death, right? With 2,000 books, it's hard to find an area that isn't been researched to death. Somehow we found one, but something like the medical evidence, I am not a medical evidence guy. I mean, I know the basics, right, from listening to podcasts and listening to other people who know much more about it and could do better work than I ever could. So I kind of put that part aside, right? Um, things like acoustics or things. I just don't. It's not my focus, my expertise. I do like to look into some of the things that aren't researched as much. And granted, I'll admit, what we found on James Herbert Martin is not intentional, right? We didn't go into this saying like we got to prove this guy was CIA, right? Or his wife was CIA. The document just happened to come out while we were researching it at NARA. So we were like, wow. So yeah, I think it's just kind of recognizing someone's like strengths or passions. For me, I don't really have passion in like the medical evidence stuff, and I know a ton of people have done a good work. Like sure, what? Like, how am I gonna add value to that conversation? I probably can't. So I just ended up focusing on other things, and I got lucky with this, and I'm working on something for Lancer this year with I'm not going to say anymore because we're in very early stages, but it's a similar situation where we kind of have a hypothesis. We don't know exactly where it's going to go. But when you have that type of open mind and you don't have you don't have a predestined kind of theory to back up or to prove, and you just follow the evidence, I think that's where really good things can still be found. Like you said, there's a ton of meat on the bone still, so many documents, but you really have to have the context to, when you go through the documents, to recognize, that doesn't make sense. This is big, right? And so my brother is funny. He jokes about me. He's like kind of interested in the JFK thing because of me. He goes, I can't listen to your podcast, man. It just goes too deep for me. And it's kind of true because, we don't take it from like step one. And because there's a million podcasts and documentaries that do that. But yeah, it gets, when you get to that point where you can understand the context, then you can really start doing document research. Like I said, I probably did 5 years of just listening before I opened a document or went to Mary Farrell. So, I didn't think that I'd ever find any interesting tidbits of documents in this case. Never when I started listening to it, even years into it. Wasn't even a thought of mine. But something had a light bulb went off, and I was like, let me look into this a little bit. And Rob, to his credit, helped me look into it. We think very differently, Rob and I. I think that's one of the reasons why we have really good conversations and back and forth, is because, he's been in this over 35 years. Me, obviously, a fraction in that. We just come from completely different points of view. And I think that type of mindset will put people in the position to discover new things and come up with new tidbits and give more context to this case, right?
Well, Joe, I appreciate the time you're able to give me to talk on my show. I'm happy we were able to do this. Hopefully I can get you and Rob on together and we can have a full discussion with the full Lone Gunman podcast. But for now, where can people find your links, Joe?
Sure. Well, we are on the Lone Gunman podcast on YouTube. Also, Lone Gunman podcast on Twitter. If you'd like to email us, it's the Lone Gunman podcast at gmail.com. I'm Joe_Borelli, but because I'm still wanting to be somewhat employable in the future, I don't tweet a bunch about this stuff. But yeah, I would say, the Lone Gunman is definitely the place to find us. We go live at 7 p.m. Eastern time every Friday night, and it's very cool. Some shows are just like hanging out on a Friday night, talking JFK. We laugh a lot, we joke a lot, and some segments are more serious depending on the topic. And you got to laugh about some of the things in this case because it's crazy. And we have a good time every Friday night. And yeah, if you're ever chilling, you want to talk JFK, you know where to find us.
I'll make sure to link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.